Can anyone hear me okay? Take that as a yes. Okay. Earlier this year, I spoke at a workshop, and I sound really loud to myself, but it's okay. No one's okay. Earlier this year, I spoke at a workshop, and I presented climate change projections from a new statistically downscaled data set that's been generated from the University of Idaho by colleagues John Abotskloo and Catherine Hedgerwish. At the time of that workshop, we were the data was still pretty fresh, and what I was projecting was, I wasn't projecting, I was presenting projections in changes in the mean state of the climate. One of the items that were of interest to the workshop attendees, of course, were how are extremes projected to change in the future? So that motivated the subtitle of this talk, which is How Will Extremes Change in Relationship to Changes in the Means? And I'm hoping this talk complements two of the talks we saw yesterday afternoon concerning how, depending on the variables, some extremes we do expect to change at different rates than the mean state. A study came out last year published by our colleagues at PKIC, and I can't remember what PKIC stands for, but they're up in British Columbia. They looked at projections from the latest generation of global climate models in the coupled model intercomparison project, phase 5, and they looked at projections and changes in extremes over the globe, and they found that in general, with some spatial variability, that changes in warm extremes follow the changes in the mean summer temperature. They also found that changes in cold extremes exceed changes in the mean winter temperature. And lastly, that changes in intensity of precipitation extremes exceed changes in the mean precipitation intensity. So we have some reason, based on some earlier studies, to expect that in some cases we will see accelerated changes in extremes versus means. So what I want to do is I want to examine the projected changes in daily temperature and precipitation extremes versus means over the Northwest using the statistically downscaled data set that is going to be applied to and is already being applied to a variety of impacts assessment studies here in the Northwest. Two of the questions I hope to address are, how do patterns of change vary across space? And are these patterns of change consistent across various global climate models? Our data is daily output from 20 CMIP5 global climate models, again statistically downscaled to 6-kilometer resolution using this method called the multivariate adaptive constructed analogs, which to the developers it's MACA, and to most other people I've heard it called MACA. I switch. I'll try and be consistent and call it MACA in the future. We chose 20 GCMs out of the larger group because these are the ones that have the daily data available for multiple variables for both historic and future projections. So I want to give an example of some changing probability distributions, just one case for the daily maximum temperature over a historic period and a future period from one GCM, averaged over Western Oregon and Washington. What you're seeing is the relative frequency across different temperatures in the summertime. The blue line is the historical frequency distribution, and the red line is the future. And these future and past are the last half of the 20th century versus the last half of the 21st century. If you know the change in state in the mean, a first easy approximation to make is that the change in the tails of your distribution are going to be the same if you don't know any better. Or I shouldn't say better, if you don't have more information. If you have more information, which we would like to, you can look at the changing shape of the distribution, and what we're seeing in this particular case is the distribution gets a little broader. The tails get a little further apart, which means temperature is getting more variable in the future, and the extremes on either end are not changing at the same rate as the mean. So this is just one GCM. Over the next few slides, I'm going to average over the 20 GCMs to get rid of some of the noise, but I'll come back later and look at the comparison across GCMs. Again, I'm going to look at the ensemble average over 20 models. I'm going to look at average changes in the means, and either the first or the 99th percentile of daily extremes, depending on whether I'm looking at the minimum temperature or the maximum temperature. Again, I'm looking at two periods. First, the second half of the last century and the current century. I'm focusing on the representative concentration pathway 8.5, which is the one, the business as usual, where we assume we don't make any drastic, or even not even drastic, but just general cuts in general to our carbon emissions. And I'm going to look at three variables: summer maximum daily during the months of June, July, August, the winter daily minimum temperature. By winter, I'm defining that as December, January, February, and then winter daily precipitation. I'm going to show several plots like this. What you're looking at is the change in the 99th percentile, and you can think of that if you want as roughly, this isn't precisely correct, but if it helps you think of it as that's the hottest day of summer, more or less. So you're looking at the change in the hottest day of summer versus the change in the mean. The purple line, I guess, is the one-to-one line. What I've done here is I've mapped those points in space so you can see where you lie depending on what color you are. Two things to note. There's, in general, the change in the 99th percentile and the change in the mean are linear related. They closely follow that purple line, but not exactly. So for any change in the mean, the change in the warmest day of summer is an extra half or 1 degree, or maybe depending on where you are in the western United States. So near the coast, there's not as big a difference between the changes in the mean and the changes in the extremes. In the interior, where the means change the most, the additional warming in the extreme is higher than it would be near the coast. Again, the relationship's rather linear. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to zoom in on Washington. And one thing I didn't mention is this is the raw CMIP5 data. I'm going to focus in now on the actual downscale data in the state of Washington and see if this relationship holds at a smaller scale. Okay, so same kind of picture, just the state of Washington, a little bit of Oregon. Again, the change in the mean and the change in the 99th percentile, the relationship is linear, but as you get to places where you're expected to warm, on average, that hottest day is expected to warm not just that much, but a little extra, a little bump. In this case, in eastern Washington, is maybe as much as an extra 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and that change decreases as you go near the coast. Keep in mind these are results from downscale global climate models, so they don't really have the resolution to deal with a lot of the fine-scale atmospheric dynamics that we see due to topography in the western United States. So that's with that caveat, I'm showing these results. Moving on to the daily minimum winter temperature, the story's a little more interesting. It's not quite a nice linear relationship. There's this funny curvature, and the points get a little bit scattered. What is interesting, though, is that I've separated the western United States into those points west of the Rocky Mountains and those points east of the Rocky Mountains. The dashed line would be the points that lie east of the Rocky Mountains. And you can see there's still, if you focus on a certain geographic area, you still get a strong relationship between the change in the extreme and the change in the mean. You just can't average over the whole western United States. And also another interesting thing is, whereas for the maximum summer temperature, whereas the change in the extreme was only maybe an extra degree warmer than the change in the mean, in the case of the winter daily minimum temperature, the change in the extremes are quite a bit faster than the change in the mean. And I'm going to zoom in on the state of Washington using the downscale data. You can see that sort of linear relationship still exists, but there's some curvature. And in eastern Washington, where the change in the mean is projected to be about 9 to 10 degrees, the change in the coldest day of the winter is expected to warm by an additional 4, maybe 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now switching last to daily precipitation. As you heard yesterday, the extremes in the heaviest storms are expected to proportionally be heavier relative to the change in the mean state. And this analysis is backing up with some of the stuff you heard yesterday. Again, there's a rather linear relationship between the changes in the extremes and the changes in the mean. An interesting thing, and this is outside of the Pacific Northwest, but there are some areas in the Southwest where we're actually projecting less precipitation in the winter time on average, but the extreme storms are still expected to get heavier. Zooming again and onto Washington. So the state of Washington is going to be more or less those points in that oval. So you zoom in on that, things are going to get kind of cloudy. So it's interesting to see if the linear relationship holds up as we zoom in. And we get these sort of interesting conic features when you plot the change in the 99th percentile versus the change in the mean. There's an interesting separation between whether you're in the eastern Washington or western Washington. The changes in precip are expected to be higher east of the Cascades. And there's still a sort of roughly linear relationship between change in the 99th percentile and the mean. But if you convince yourself if you can split the state in two. And in some cases, there is no projected difference between the change in the 99th percentile and the change in the mean. But in some cases, in some areas, it's an extra 5%. Okay, now I'm going to look at individual GCMs to see if these patterns hold up across GCMs before I just sort of average them all together to get rid of some of that noise. I'm going to average over a box. I'm going to average over eastern part of the Pacific Northwest where changes are more homogeneous because when you go from the coast to the Cascades, there's quite a gradient in change. So here are a couple more probability distributions. Here I'm plotting the cumulative distribution function. Again, historical and a future case. This is just an example of one particular GCM run. What I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract these two probability distributions, and I'm going to plot that difference against the distribution itself and rotate the plot 90 degrees. It'll hopefully make sense when you see it, but I wanted to prepare you for what's coming. Okay, this is a plot of the change in the probability distribution versus the actual probability. So you've got cumulative probability across the x-axis, the change in the distribution, or the change in the temperature on the y-axis from the historical period to the future period. We've got the hot days on the right, the cool days in the summer on the left. If those two distributions maintain the same shape and just shifted, all these lines would be horizontal, but shifted forward, upward. But they're not. All the hot days are a little hotter than the mean change, and all the cold days are don't warm as much as the mean days. So basically what you're seeing over 20 different GCMs, so there's a squiggle there, but the pattern's roughly consistent. You see the probability distribution getting broader, and the rate of change of the hottest days exceeds the rate of change in the mean by a small amount, by a couple of degrees. This is summer temperature. Winter temperatures are a rather different story. You get this interesting shape. And what you're seeing now is the warm nights on the right are not warming as much as the mean is warming. But the cold nights on the left are warming more than the mean is warming. So instead of a broadening of the distribution, you're getting a narrowing of distribution, which means less variability in temperature in the winter time in the future, which is an interesting thing to consider. The other interesting thing to me about this figure is if you look at these coldest nights, the more rare nights, there's a pretty big difference between what one model is saying and another. So In one case, the range goes from a warming of 4 degrees to a warming of 21 degrees, which is a bit startling. So you have to wonder about how well some of these GCMs are really handling the atmospheric circulation and other processes correctly, because that's rather alarming result. Lastly, looking at wet day precipitation, is a pretty steady pattern across the GCMs. As your events get heavier and more rare, the relative change in precipitation increases relative to the mean change. So overall, over the eastern Pacific Northwest, in the wintertime, we're projecting the models are projecting a 14% increase in precip. If you look at the rarer events, the one in 100 event, instead of a 14% increase, it's closer to 20. And if you go out to the rarest events, you see possibly as much as a 30% increase in the size of these storms, and but the range becomes really big. So there's a lot of uncertainty in where that tail is going to land. Some models are saying only a 9%, 8% increase in precipitation. Others as much as 60. So there's certainly a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen at that extreme end of the tail. So in summary, what we're seeing from the projections is extremes are changing at rates faster than the mean state. And by the latter half of the 21st century, these are just some numbers to do some back of the envelope computations, or just numbers to take home. Hottest days of summer will warm an extra 1 to 2 degrees over the mean state change. The coldest nights of winter are projected to warm an extra 1 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And the wettest days of winter are projected to snow an extra 0 to 5%. And all these things change as you go from the coast to the interior. Changes are stronger in the interior. And another thing to remember, these are all based on the most pessimistic representative concentration pathway. And lastly, so what I've shown, I hope, is changes in extremes can be related to changes in means. The relationship in many cases is approximately linear, which could be handy, but it's region specific. And large uncertainties and changes in the cold extremes and extremes in precipitation intensities exist across the GCM ensemble. Okay, questions?
We've got the 1 or 2 questions.
Good.
It's very dangerous to do this kind of study using a statistical model. In fact, if you use a properly as a dynamically downscaled model, what happens is you get just the opposite result, that the distribution does change with less maximum. So I'm saying it's really a problem using statistical downscaling for this kind of study. The other thing is you have to remove the crazy GCMs. Some of them don't match the contemporary period. So to downscale to these GCMs that don't match the contemporary periods doesn't work out. So I think there's 2 issues that you need to consider carefully.
Okay, yeah, I can summarize. And in general, I agree with what Cliff said. You need to be careful when you're using statistically downscaled data. You really should be using dynamically downscaled data to get at these processes. And the second point was you should be weeding out those GCMs that really aren't doing things right, because they can mislead you. And I agree, a step to cull some of those crazy GCMs is an important one. And in terms of the statistical downscaling, yes, we'll learn a lot more from dynamical downscaling. I did this on the raw GCM prior to statistical downscaling as well, and the results really don't change much through the statistical downscaling process. Yeah.
Last winter, there was sort of a macro scale change that it was involving polar warming, and it was largely unpredicted. If you're looking at extremes, how much do the extremes fall sort of versus these large events
Well, the GCMs really aren't designed to predict what's going to happen in any particular winter. And I mean, I could look through you'd have to look through a GCM record and see what it produces over its whole record, and to see if the GCMs ever, you know, do produce something like that. And I can't. I really can't answer I can't give you a precise answer to your question. I'm sorry, but I think Cliff seems to want to. But
I mean, GCMs don't do weather prediction. That's not true. So it's.
So we have to move on.